Last week we spoke about Joshua and how his leading of the Israelite people into the desert caused him to ask them a question of whom they were going to serve, whether it was going to be the gods of their fathers or the true, living, one true God. So today we're going to continue with that series, but we're going to look now into the New Testament for application that comes from there. If you remember back in high school, everyone was trying to find out who they were. They were trying to have this sense of belonging. And it dictated all 4 years of high school, which group you belonged to and how you acted. The funny thing is that no matter what it is that you did to try and find yourself, whether it was to dress a certain way, to act a certain way, talk a certain way, we always found ourselves submitting to some sort of group, some sort of clique, if you will. I remember when I was in high school, just to name a few, there were the jocks, those who were on the football team, the baseball team. They typically walked around the school wearing Letterman jackets, and they were the guys to be. You had the preps, those who had all the fancy, nice clothes, and they acted a certain way and grouped together, and they were the above average students, if you will. You also had the cheerleaders walking around in their uniforms, and they all clung together, and we're always watching movies about how they team up against other girls in the school and stuff like that. I don't know how true that was, but the cheerleaders, they always hung together, they always wore their uniforms and whatnot. You had the goths. Those were the ones I was scared of. Not really, I'm just messing. But the goths, you always found them grouped together. They were all dressed in black. They had the dark makeup, and they always looked so solemn and so whatever. Okay, those are the goths. And then you had the nerds. And some of you guys might say, that's the group that I belong to. Probably, I don't know. But they were always, again, hung out with each other. They were the smart ones. They were the ones that everyone wanted to copy off of when it came to homework and tests. We often look at images of who the nerds are, and they carry calculators and pens and stuff like that, typically wear glasses, and here we go. And then there's actually a new group that's come out within the last few years, the hipsters. I don't know anything about them, so we're going to skip over them. Anyway, the point is that each group that you belonged to in high school, they each had their own stereotypical behavior. They each had their own stereotypical dress, their way of doing things, the people they hung out with. And while we were in high school and we're trying to find out who it is that we are as people, once we joined one of those groups, we wanted to be just like them. We wanted to be accepted. We wanted to have this sense of belonging. And so as a result, we willingly submitted ourselves to whatever it is that they were doing. If they dressed a certain way, we would dress a certain way. If they talked a certain way, we would talk a certain way. So we willingly submitted ourselves to the culture, if you will, of the group in which we belonged. And that's the key here, is that we willingly submitted. Okay? In the New Testament, to willingly submit to an authority meant that you became a bondservant to that authority. The word bondservant comes from the Greek word doulos, and literally translated, it actually means slave. So in a sense, I know it's a harsh word to use in this example here, but in a sense, when we belong to this certain group of people and we submitted ourselves to them, we actually became slaves of whatever it is that they wanted us to do. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. I know I'm just using high school, but I'm trying to get the concept across to you, is that we submit ourselves to someone, so we start to act like them, we start to become like them, we start to dictate our lives according to their standards. So why is this important? Who we submit to, who we follow, that becomes our lifestyle. Our thoughts, our actions, it's all dictated by whoever we place in that authority. It's all dictated by whoever is above us, whoever is calling the shots. And that can either be a good thing or a bad thing, and that's what we're going to look at today. Paul uses this concept of bondservants and slaves in his letter to the Romans. So that's where we're going to be today. If you want to go ahead and turn there, if you have a Bible, Romans chapter 6 is where we're going to be at. Joshua, in Joshua 24, asked the people of the Hebrew people, who are you going to serve? Are you going to serve the gods of your fathers? Or are you going to serve the one true living God? And Paul basically asks the same thing here of the Romans, but he asks it a little bit differently. And so we're going to start here, Romans chapter 6, verse 16. And I'm going to read the first half, and we're going to pause, and we're going to look at different verses here and whatnot as we go through it. So Romans chapter 6, verse 16 says, "Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves or bondservants," anywhere it says slave, you can put bondservant. "Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey?" Okay, that sounds kind of obvious. I'm chopping it right there. He continues, and we're going to get to that, but I'm going to stop it right there. The people back then in Rome knew this concept of slavery. Slaves were of a lower class. Their lifestyle was undesirable. They were the ones in the households who would wash feet and serve food. And you were a bondservant because something was owed to the person to which you were bonded to. So to have this lifestyle of being connected to somebody in a servant type way, it looked really bad. The Romans had this idea of autonomy, being able to make your own decisions in life. But if you were a bondservant to somebody, someone else made those decisions for you. And what Paul is saying here to the people is that if you present yourselves as willing bondservants, you are willingly going into this, you become slaves of the one to whom you obey. Okay? The second half of the verse continues with the application that he's trying to draw here from this. So I'm going to read it again, but the whole thing. "Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness?" Paul has basically asked the Romans the same thing that Josh asked to the Hebrews back in his day. Paul is asking, are you going to willingly submit to sin, which leads to death? Or are you willingly going to submit to obedience, which leads to righteousness? Just like Josh asked the Hebrews, are you going to follow the old gods of your fathers, the sinful ways of doing things? Or are you going to follow God, the true God, and submit to obedience, which leads to righteousness? And continue reading to the next verse. Romans 6, 17 and 18 says, "But thanks be to God, that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed, and, having been set free from sin, have become slaves to righteousness." Now, the first time I read this verse, I thought, okay, Paul is being pretty sarcastic here. He's going, it's a good thing that you guys are now slaves to righteousness, right? You guys are being slaves to righteousness, right? Almost kind of like poking at them, like, I know that you guys know not to be slaves to sin. That's why you're being slaves to righteousness, correct? But now that I read it again, it took me a couple times. I read it and I reread it, and the impression changed on me. And I started to read it more like, you know, you can be slaves to sin or slaves to righteousness. But thank God you guys chose to be slaves to righteousness, because sin is a bad thing. And being slaves to righteousness, bondservants to righteousness, you are now sanctified. And you now have eternal life, which we're going to get to here in a minute. Verse 19 and 20 says, "I am speaking in human terms because of your natural limitations." We're people. We need examples, just like I gave the example of high school. Okay. For just as you once presented your members as slaves to impurity and to lawlessness, leading to more lawlessness, so now present your members as slaves to righteousness, leading to sanctification. Whoever it is that we follow, it leads to something. And Paul is saying here that if you present yourselves as slaves, as bondservants to sin or to lawlessness, it leads to more lawlessness. It's a continuous cycle, a snowball effect, if you will. But if we present ourselves as bondservants or slaves to righteousness, it leads to sanctification. Sanctification meaning set aside for a holy purpose, as we talked about last week. Whoever you submit to, that's who you become. In high school, as you submitted to these different cliques of the jocks, of the cheerleaders, of the nerds, whoever it was, you saw that suddenly your lifestyle and your thinking and your speech started to mimic theirs. I noticed, we started to like some of the same music. We started to like some of the same movies. We started to like some of the same sports. And in some cases, people actually come to like the same crushes. That always created drama. Additionally, when you follow one crowd, you start to disregard the other. So if you're becoming more like a jock, you'll disregard the nerds. If you want to be more like a cheerleader and you hang out with the cheerleaders, you're not going to be like the goths. When you follow one authority, you start to disregard and forsake all the other ones. I know this is true because Jesus explained that this is how it works with God and an unhealthy love of money in Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. Remember, he said that you cannot serve two masters, that you'll either hate one or despise the other. And it's the same thing here, that when we submit to one, we start to disregard the other. And Paul actually says that here, verse 20. For when you were slaves of sin, you were free in regard to righteousness. While you were busy serving sin, serving lawlessness, you couldn't turn and do righteousness because you were over here doing sin. That's why Josh, back in Joshua chapter 24, told them, pick this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your fathers or the one true God, because whichever one you picked, you weren't going to be able to serve the other. And if the Hebrews were serving the gods of the fathers, they wouldn't have been able to serve the one true living God. Last little section here, verse 21 and 22. But what fruit were you getting at that time from the things of which you are now ashamed? What benefit were you getting when you were slaves to sin, when you were doing all this lawlessness, this unrighteousness? What benefit was it? What can you show from what you did? What is it that you have left to show for it? For the end of those things is death. Sin leads to death. For the wages of sin is death. But now that you have been set free from sin, if you are a follower of Christ, you are set free from sin, and have become slaves or bondservants to God, the fruit you get leads to sanctification and its end, eternal life. If we choose to bond ourselves, to cast our lot in, if you will, with God, we get sanctification, set apart, like I said, for a holy purpose. And in the end, we get eternal life with Christ. We get to go to heaven. If we submit to sin and to unrighteousness and to unlawlessness, yeah, it may be fun in the moment, and everyone else may accept it. But what are you getting from that? Is it doing anything to benefit your soul? That's something we have to look at. Paul here, in these last two verses, begins to talk about fruit, which is a reference to his earlier letter to the Galatian church in Galatians. The reference comes from Galatians chapter 5, verse 19 through 23. And I'm not going to read it. You guys can go ahead and read it. The reference should be down here at the bottom. But go ahead and read that for yourselves, and you'll see that the works of the flesh, which he starts off with, are manifested in sin and in lawlessness. And if you read that, you're like, yeah, that looks like today's society, today's world. But the fruit of the Spirit is manifested when we submit ourselves to obedience, When we submit ourselves to the will of God, we start to see all the good things in our life, which the end of the verse says, against such there is no law. If we practice love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, etc., no one's going to look at us and go, wow, that's so wrong. No. We want to see that. It's a desirable trait. But it only manifests in our life if we submit ourselves to sanctification, to holiness. Josh asked the Hebrews to put away the idols of their fathers, to serve the one true and holy God. And Paul asked the same thing of the Romans, to become bondservants, willing bondservants, to obedience, to righteousness, to God. And to put away our submission to sin, our submission to death. This week we need to be mindful of who it is that we're submitting to, and we need to be mindful of who it is that we are serving. Are we serving the one true God in everything that we do? Or have we submitted ourselves as willing bondservants to sin and to unrighteousness, which he says later leads to death?